This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina and the Charleston Festival by Historic Charleston Foundation, celebrating houses, history, and culture with tours, concerts, workshops, and more. March 13th through April 13th. Learn more at thecharlestonfestivalsc.org.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. flocomuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. This week, we'll be talking with Betsy Teter and Jim Neighbors about their book, North of Main, Spartanburg's Historic Black Neighborhoods of North Dean Street, Gas Bottom, and Back of the College.
Along with co-author Brenda Lee Pryce, Betsy and Jim have created an in-depth book about Spartanburg's Black history, which focuses on the post-emancipation years. In the 1870s, former slaves spent their hard-won post-slavery wages to purchase lots and build homes north of Main Street. As the decades rolled by, they and their descendants established a string of neighborhoods encompassing hundreds of houses.
The history of these places is extraordinary in its demonstration of the heroism, courage, determination, and pride of Black citizens of Spartanburg, who built dynamic and historically significant neighborhoods in treacherous times. Jim Neighbors and Betsy Teter, it's wonderful to have you today on the Journal, especially to talk about your book, North of Main, Spartanburg's Historic Black Neighborhoods of North Dean Street, Gas Bottom, and Back of the College. So, Betsy, before we get into the book, tell our folks a little bit about you and what Hub City is all about.
Oh, briefly. Okay. I'm the third generation of a Spartanburg family. I'm a Wake Forest grad with a degree in history. I'm a journalist who worked at 4 newspapers in the Carolinas, and then for 22 years, I was executive director of the Hub City Writers Project, which John Lane, my husband, and I founded in 1995. It's a publisher of books about place, literature, and history, and we're about to celebrate our 30th anniversary.
Wow. Okay. And Jim?
Well, first, I'd like to say how much of an honor it is to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me and us. And also that I regret that Dr. Pryce, Brenda Lee Pryce, our third co-author, wasn't able to join us today. In nearly every way, she's the heart and soul of this work and of the project that we've been working on over the years. I am not a third-generation Spartanburgian. I am from Seattle and work at Wofford College. Started there in 2003. And we live in the Greenville area now.
All right. Well, let's talk about the evolution of the book. You mentioned South of Main and North of Main. We're talking about the creation of Black communities of free persons of color. We'll start with some free persons of color, and then after the war, freed men and women had to create a world for themselves.
Well, we did do a book 20 years ago called South of Main, which explored a 40-acre area of the city that was taken during urban renewal, which was the newer of the 2 Black neighborhoods in Spartanburg. The North of Main is the story of the one that began right after emancipation in the back door of what was Wofford College. So this book, the 3 of us got together and have been working for years on a project that explores basically a 300-acre area of Spartanburg and how it got there, who lived there, what their lives were like, and what happened to it.
Well, I think you really are telling not just the history of the community, but as you discuss the struggles for ownership, building a house, getting just living conditions, and the continual threat during Reconstruction and afterwards of not just these communities, but really you're telling the history of South Carolina. This is a microcosm of what was happening in Columbia, in Charleston, and actually the South. in urban areas. All of a sudden, if you're now a freedman, you're an American citizen, what are you going to do? Where are you going to work? Where are you going to live?
I've always been fascinated by that question of what happened right after the Civil War. So we dug into who were those 250 black voters in 1868. Spartanburg had a big blank in this period. You know, we knew the first public school showed up in 1884, but we didn't know much before that. So we went digging into that era to find out things that we didn't know. And that's what the early part of this book is about.
All right. Well, let's get to specifics, because back of the college and the role of Wofford, good and bad in this story, is important.
It is. You know, as we were chatting before we went on air about how common this story is, right, throughout the South and probably in many ways throughout the entire country, right? You know, what's in a neighborhood? What makes a neighborhood? For these people, it was everything. Right, as you said, right, okay, I am now considered, you know, a free person, right? What do I do? I've got to earn some money. I've got to live somewhere. How am I going to do that? I want to be free in some way, right? What does that mean? And so, I've been thinking about this in sort of preparation for today. What is in the neighborhood? I mean, you think about a neighborhood. I grew up in a neighborhood in Seattle that was pretty nondescript, and, you know, the neighborhood that the people that we've looked at built was everything, right? This is a place where, you know, they were protected to a certain extent. They were able to eventually own, right, property and the land that they were on. They could care for one another in these communities that they were building. They could develop resources and knowledge, right, together, right? A tremendous sense of identity and pride about the work that they were doing in building these neighborhoods and, of course, their lives. And then they were outside of the white gaze, right, to a certain extent, you know, in these neighborhoods as well. I mean, you know, you start thinking about how important, how massively important just building a neighborhood is. That's what I've really learned to a certain extent in working on this project. And the fact that I had to learn that, I think, says a lot, of course, about the difference in white and black lived experience in this country.
To me, it was fascinating that a black man actually was one of the first land developers back at the college. And let's talk about that story, because that's not, I mean, I really was sort of, wow. I mean, this is, you think about developers, there is a white guy who's got it, and I'm going to cut it into lots, and I'm going to sell it to the black folks. But this is not the case.
Right. Well, we have a story that begins right at the end of the Civil War with a white Methodist college president and minister who has landed in Spartanburg. He's from upstate New York. And he winds up with a big chunk of land behind Wofford when it goes up for auction. He develops a little bit of it, and then he leaves town, and he sells it to a man named Reverend C.C. Scott, which is a name that had completely disappeared from the history of Spartanburg. Reverend Scott comes from Charleston, and his family was a free family. He, over about 10 years, begins selling a larger number of lots to the black community. And he moves on around to other places in South Carolina, but he has a very momentous life in Spartanburg during this era of lynching. And so that's a good story in the book. So I'll recommend to your listeners to read about that.
All right. So we get people building houses, but communities also include churches, schools, lodges, that kind of thing. So when did they begin to show up?
Well, that's, the north side black community in Spartanburg is built around a church, of course, right? Silver Hill United Methodist Church, or Silver Hill Methodist Church, as it was called when it was organized in 1869 or so, right? And they met in, City Hall for a period of time, and then were able to acquire some property and start, a church there. And this is such an important, 9 different families pooled their resources together, right, to be able to buy some land and then to begin right, building a church there. And then those families, of course, are founding families, right, in the neighborhood, right? The people who are building the neighborhood build the church, and everything sort of grows from there.
They have a school in the church very soon thereafter.
And the school is staffed by, children and people of these families. And it's a common school. Everybody, who wants to learn can go there and so on. So, it becomes a place of worship, an educational center. It becomes a community organizing place, of course, right? And the neighborhood grows from that church. And then, several others that grow up over the years as well.
Is the church still there?
The church is not still there. So the church was there until,
98.
Yeah, 98. And saw the writing on the wall about how the neighborhood was disappearing and moved to a different part of town. The church still exists.
The congregation
still exists, excuse me, yep.
Okay. But again, that's an integral part of neighborhoods. The church is there. You walk to church. And as you chronicle, as the neighborhood began to decline, so did the church.
Right. And at one point, there are 10 churches in this 300 acres. And now there is one that meets maybe with a half a dozen people. And that's all that's left.
And which may have been the first one to organize.
Yes. Yeah.
The Metropolitan AME Zion may have been organizing about 1866. And still, the building's still there, and as you said, there's still a congregation worshiping.
Well, we are right now in the post-Civil War period, but it expands, and at its zenith, how large is the area that we're talking about as a neighborhood?
Well, there are roughly 2,000 people living there. There are 3 different neighborhoods, as you see from the subtitle of our book, but they're all contiguous. And so the heyday probably would have been the 1950s. That's when we had 2 public schools, 10 churches, and hundreds of homes. And that's about the time we begin to see early urban renewal, highway construction, Wofford expansion, Converse College expansion, and development.
And what about businesses?
Lots of eateries, groceries, community stores, beauty shops, juke joints. The residents like to say that they really didn't have to leave the neighborhood to get what they needed, right?
Well, I think that's important because that's true in so many Southern communities. With the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, certainly in the 1880s, African Americans in South Carolina basically withdrew from the community in general. Yes, they might work in the white part of town, but they created their own world. As you mentioned, they felt safe, and it was a world that, quite frankly, the white community didn't pay a lot of attention to.
No, that's what's been fascinating about releasing a book like this in a town like Spartanburg, who knew very little, if any, of this story. And, that's been a big part of what drove Jim and I, and for Brenda, Dr. Pryce, it was to give the gift back to her people of something that didn't get really recorded during the time. And I also want to mention that Jim and Brenda Pryce did dozens of oral histories along with a group of Wofford students, and Jim can tell you more about that. But that was critical in telling this story.
Where are those interviews housed now?
Good question. They are on a website. They're available or accessible on a companion website to this book project called backofthecollege.org. So you can go there and listen to all of the recorded interviews and see a bunch of photographs and read some history. And you can actually, what we've also done over the years is trace the residential history of the neighborhood as completely as possible. So U.S. Census data, city directory data, other data has yielded a searchable database in which users on the website can look up any residents at any time and find out who was there and what they were doing according to the data that was recorded at the time.
Well, that's a wonderful resource.
I don't think there's ever been anything that deep done on a southern neighborhood before.
Well, I think you probably will find some folks digging into. Really, Jim, that's great. You did that as part of one of your classes, or?
We did, yes. I would teach a first-year course in the fall every year. So first-year students coming into the college, I would sort of turn them into oral ethnographers and data researchers. And they'd hit the library and start transcribing U.S. Census data and city directory data and interview former residents of the neighborhood, people who graduated from the public high school there and so on, to try and, again, help the story get told.
Well, the public high school disappeared with desegregation, because it seems like I remember
the Cumming Street School building, which was the first, was finished in 1926.
And I might add, was named after this New York Methodist minister who was the first owner of the land.
Right. But they misspelled his name on the building.
But they misspelled his name on the building.
They dropped the S. But Cumming Street School building, started initially as the first high school for black students in the city. And then when Carver was built in 1938, it became an elementary and junior high school at that point. But that building, which was built in the back of the college neighborhood, was an absolute center of the neighborhood in so many different ways. Along with the churches, the high school, or Cumming Street School building, was a source of tremendous pride and activity and identity for the residents of the neighborhood. That building still exists. It's owned by Wofford College. It has been condemned for asbestos contamination, so no one can go in it, but it still sits on campus, and its future has yet to be determined.
Okay. Well, that's not the only building that Wofford owns. You own one of the former churches as well, right?
Yeah, Greater Trinity AME Church. Wofford purchased in 2014 or so, and has converted into a studio arts facility.
Okay. All right, we talked about the development of the neighborhoods, the three neighborhoods, and their zenith in the 1950s. Then they began a demise, and they're not all the same story. Wofford College the two colleges, Converse, play a role in that. And then, of course, Great Society programs, urban renewal played a role. And in many communities across the South, highway construction, destruction of neighborhoods.
Right. And the first part of this neighborhood to go was an area called Gas Bottom, which was probably the poorest area of Spartanburg. A lot of landlord-owned homes that were nothing more than shacks. But I do think it's important for us to realize that in those tenant shacks lived human beings with full lives who are part of the larger story of Spartanburg. And so that's why we tell the story of Gas Bottom. Not only that, but because of the gas plant it's named after, which pumps chemicals into the neighborhood for decades. Gas Bottom goes in the very first urban renewal project in South Carolina, number one.
What was the project?
It's called the Gas Bottom Clearance Project.
So they just cleared it, but what were they going to put in its place?
Well, let's see. Back with the very first one, you could not turn the land over to development. So they put in a field, a baseball field, some gardens, and then the state law gets changed shortly thereafter. And now there's a series of car dealerships up and down what used to be Gas Bottom.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then I think Jim can talk to us a little bit about where Wofford begins to encroach in the neighborhood.
Yes, Wofford, as the GI Bill, starts to take effect, starts seeing increased revenue and starts realizing in the early 1950s that it really needs to expand, its campus. So one example of that is the renovation of the central building on campus called Old Main. When they renovated that building, they built a new sort of entranceway which faced north, which is where the neighborhood was, the back of the college, the black neighborhood was, sort of signaling their intention to start moving in that direction. Over the next 20 years or so, Wofford started opportunistically buying property as it became available at that time. As if someone decided to sell, Wofford would put a bid on it and take the house if they could. If someone were living there, Wofford would serve as kind of a landlord until they left. If no one was living there, then they would, take the house down. So then you started seeing more and more sort of green space in the neighborhood where houses once stood over those 20 years. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, Wofford started developing specific plans to expand and how to do that. That resulted in very specific, deliberate, acquisition of property and demolition of houses that really took off in the early 1990s. New tennis courts facility, and then when the football stadium was built as part of the larger effort to attract the Carolina Panthers into town for their training camps in the summer and so forth in the mid 1990s.
What's the neighborhood doing all this time?
So
how are they reacting to this?
Yeah. So two things about this. First, Wofford wants to tell a story about their role in this history that is different than the one that we found. Wofford says, for some reason, the neighborhood started to fall into decline in the 1970s. And because it did, then Wofford was able to take this opportunity and relieve people of certain burdens and then make a sort of bad thing into a good thing, and expand the college, provide a real benefit to the city, and so on. But what they fail to accept or acknowledge publicly is the fact that since they were taking houses down opportunistically, that was causing the neighborhood to go into decline. And so residents were protesting this, resisting this. Some were very upset about it. Others who owned their houses sold their house to Wofford when they found a good price and were able to benefit from that. Others expressed a general sense of, progress is probably a good thing. But I think in general, most people that we've spoken with were very unhappy with the fact that their neighborhood disappeared. There were specific protests that were organized a few times over the years to Wofford's encroachment, which we talk about in the book as well.
And the neighborhood was always called back of the college.
Some people called it behind the college. I found that out subsequently. But yes, it became known as back of the college.
Yeah. Or some called it behind the wall, too, right? They described a kind of glass wall dividing Wofford from the neighborhood. I mean, there literally is, the college, right, and then across the street, the neighborhood. So there's just a street called Evans Street that separates, the neighborhood from the college in many ways. And many of the residents talk about not feeling welcome on campus or having been told not to go on campus over the years. And so describe it as a kind of wall. But at the same time, especially after Wofford desegregated in '64, and there were black students on campus, other students thought that it was important to interact with the neighborhood more, and so different programs were developed. One was called Happy Saturdays, organized by some students that invited neighborhood children onto campus and provided a number of different programs and activities and that sort of thing to increase that kind of interaction.
So is there anything at all left of the back of the college neighborhood now?
The Cumming Street School building, as I said, still stands, and the Greater Trinity AME Church building is there. One of the other really important churches was a Baptist church, Cumming Street Baptist Church, which sat next to the high school or the school building. That was taken down in 2018, and the last house that was privately owned was taken down this past year.
And in the broader neighborhood, in Gas Bottom, there is nothing left, not even the gas plant.
Yeah.
And up on North Dean Street, yes, there are about 25 homes that were built turn of the century and are, for the most part, still occupied by black residents.
So what we're talking about is 3 neighborhoods and 2 have disappeared.
And one is clinging to life.
Okay.
And it's being gentrified right now, too.
It is being gentrified right now, yeah.
The one North Dean Street is being gentrified.
It is.
Oh, yes. You can buy a house up there for $600,000 now.
Wow.
I was going to say maybe you could buy a house up here. Not me.
So where did the folks who used to live in these neighborhoods go? Where do they live now?
Very good question.
Many of them went to public housing. Those that owned their home and had some assets as the neighborhoods went away scattered. I mean, there are enclaves, Park Hills, Duncan Park, Plainview Drive, circling the city, little enclaves of the people who lived here. A lot of them went directly to assisted living centers and then were gone.
Yeah, I mean, 55% of the residents or so pretty consistently over the years were renting, right, in the neighborhood. They had 30 days, right, when they were told that, the house was being sold. So they had time to scramble a few of their possessions together and try and find some place to go and go. People who owned their homes, had a bit more time and could plan a bit more. But yeah, as Betsy said, people just sort of scattered and went where they could.
Well, I was interested in the more modern period where you had two of the state's most famous civil rights leaders in Spartanburg.
Yeah, that's right. DeQuincy Newman was there, and Judge Matthew Perry, there in the 50s as the civil rights era unfolded. They were there working together and working around the state and traveling to Washington. And, we tell the story in the book of the young woman, Winona Douglas, who integrates Spartan High by herself in 1964, I think that is. We tell the story of the lunch counter sit-in, which for the most part, everyone has assumed over the years that it was done by young men. And we went looking for who was the young woman in the picture, found some old newspaper articles that referred to her as the leader. We tracked her down. We had a phone call into her home.
Where she live now?
She went to New York, and then she went to Austin, and Brenda Pryce was going to call her and interview her, and she died the week that we found her and were going to interview her.
And her name?
Myrtle Williams. Myrtle Williams, yeah. So the story of Myrtle Williams and the lunch counter sit-ins is in the book.
Well, that's another fascinating part of the book is you tell the neighborhoods, but in each chapter you have a spotlight on an individual and you tell their story.
Right. Yeah. And particularly those people that had disappeared that we wanted to resurrect and make a part of the community's history after they had sort of disappeared from local knowledge.
These are such amazing people, right? I mean, the stories, getting to know the people, right, of this history has been just such an extraordinary experience for me. From Tobe Hartwell, right, who was enslaved by Wofford's second president, Albert Shipp, brought from North Carolina, enslaved and enslaved on campus, and after the war ended, was one of the builders of the neighborhood, right, and then went on to become a really important person in Spartanburg. Worked as a greeter and sort of security person at Spartanburg First National Bank, right downtown, and he and his son were lamplighters and, just a really, really important person. So important, in fact, that the city decided to name its first public housing complex after him, Hartwell Courts, right, in 1940. The Thompson family. Jack Thompson was a brick mason, listed as a brick mason in the 1870 census, who was enslaved in town and who may very well have been one of the people who built Old Main, the central building on Wofford's campus, right? The central building on Wofford's campus was built by enslaved workmen. He might have been one of those people who then settled in the area and who contributed to building the church and then who built a house there and raised his family there. And one of his children, Asa Thompson, becomes this incredible educator, goes off to get his education, returns, becomes a principal of Carrier Street School, and then a principal of one of the Sears schools. Rosenwald schools, yeah, thank you. And a real activist in the community, right, to improve Black people's lives, and said, chief among many things, that what Black students really needed was secondary education, right, and worked and lobbied for years to persuade city officials to build a high school for Black students, and succeeded, right, in that work.
All right, you mentioned Mr. Thompson. You kind of skipped over him to get to his son.
Yeah.
He just didn't build Old Main, which, quite frankly, forget about that. He became one of the largest brick contractors.
No, another guy.
Another guy. Yeah.
That is
Another guy. Excuse me.
Thomas Boehmer.
Okay.
Thomas Boehmer, who may or may not have been the son of Dr. Cleveland, a white physician in town. The Boehmer family believes that he is. Thomas Boehmer built almost a dozen textile plants all over Spartanburg County and beyond. This is in the 1890s as they're all coming out of the ground. You know, he builds textile plants in Orangeburg and here in Columbia, all over Spartanburg County. Yeah, he's the foremost textile builder in the South at this point.
Well, I was going to say there was a story, was it in the Charlotte paper, that said he didn't accept a contract of less than $25,000.
That's right. That's right.
You have to have your standards.
Yeah. The home that he built with the wealth that he generated still stands on the other side of on the west side of Wofford College, and it's the Woodward Mortuary now. But his home is still there.
Now that is an incredible story of an enslaved person, what he did after the war. I mean, that's the fact that textile magnates are coming to this black man to build their mills.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And he's related to, I can't remember how he's related to Charles Boehmer, right?
Yeah, he is the nephew
Okay.
of Charles Boehmer, who founds the first school, builds buildings in the city, runs a grocery, and
is the first elected official.
One of the four black aldermen that are elected during this post-war period.
That was the other thing that was fascinating. Even into the late 19th century, there is a black elected official because it's by wards, right?
It's by wards. And we found a newspaper clip where someone was saying, we have to get rid of these wards. We can't have black people elected to office in Spartanburg. And of course, at that point, Ben Tillman's Constitution kicks in, and we don't have another black elected official in Spartanburg for 100 years.
And now you have your second black mayor.
And we have a second black mayor. We have a black fire chief, a black police chief, black university president, and a majority black city council in Spartanburg.
And the population of Spartanburg today is roughly 45% African American?
That's right.
Okay.
One of the other stories, too, that I think is really fascinating is, you start tracing these histories, and it just becomes more and more fascinating. But the Richard Rivers family, right? The Richard Rivers story. So Richard Rivers was enslaved. At least we know he was enslaved in Charleston, and then for some reason, immediately after the war ended, he walked from Charleston to Spartanburg, all 200 miles or so, right, through some of my biggest nightmares of swamp and snakes and so forth, and builds a house up there and starts his family up there, is one of the founding families, again, of the Silver Hill Church. And so his children, right?
He gets elected to city council.
He gets elected to city council, that's right.
And his son works in a manufacturing plant. His grandson becomes principal of the Cumming Street School. His great-grandson becomes a very close associate of Elijah Muhammad and is the cartoonist for the Muhammad Speaks newspaper for the 1960s, the entire 60s.
Nation of Islam, yeah.
At the end of the 60s, he comes home and he's the art director at the Greenville News. Of course, there's Mary H. Wright. We have an elementary school in Spartanburg named after Mary H. Wright, and she is born into slavery, and she becomes a school teacher, and over 50 years teaches thousands of young people. There's a story in the book about her father, Lot Farrow. He builds a cabin for the family on sort of the front door of Wofford, on the far side of Wofford. And sometime in the 1990s, the Historical Association sees this cabin getting ready to be torn down. They don't know what it is. They don't know that it's the home of Mary H. Wright and Lot Farrow, who are important historical figures. They save it by taking it over to the Girl Scout camp. And through the process of this book, we put two and two together and are able to inform the community that the Lot Faro cabin from 1870s is sitting over at the Girl Scout camp. And I know Dr. Brenda Pryce is very interested in seeing if we could bring that cabin back and put it in a little bit more prominent place in Spartanburg.
But, I mean, that really illustrates, I think, how important this history is, right? I mean, the Spartanburg Historical Association members, right, who are steeped in history, right, and who know the history of this town, did not know anything about the history of that house. These stories haven't been told, right, for all kinds of reasons, which have a lot to do with white supremacy and racism and so on over the years, right? So these histories, have to become public knowledge.
Well, now you have helped broaden the history of Spartanburg with this book. And how have the folks at Wofford reacted to it, Jim?
We were talking about this. So, it's not unusual, let's say, when a Wofford professor, publishes a book, for Wofford to say something about it, to promote it, to highlight it here and there and so on. Nothing of that sort has happened yet. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Wofford has sort of told its version of the story. It's different than the one that we're telling now. I think Wofford has a tremendous opportunity right now to face this history in a way that is responsible and work with the community in building a new kind of history that involves everyone, right, and acknowledges everybody.
Well, I couldn't help but going through the list of people who financially help support this work, and it's an A list.
Yes, it is.
It's a who's who in Spartanburg.
It is.
So I think that says something too.
We're very glad to have the level of support we have at the Hub City Writers Project. 30 years in, our community is still with us, still behind us, and still believes in the things that we do.
Okay.
And it shows that people really want to hear these stories, to know these stories, I think.
Right. So any last words before we do go off?
I think this book shows what the Hub City Writers Project does best, and I'm very proud of it, and I know Jim is too.
All right.
I'm very proud of it. And I'm were it not for this project, generally speaking, no one would have known outside of the people who lived it anything about this history. So I'm delighted that we're just skimming the surface. There's a lot more to say, and I hope other people follow up and continue this work.
Well, Jim Neighbors and Betsy Teter, thank you so much for being with us today on the Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. North of Maine tells the story of how post-emancipation black districts arose in Spartanburg and how they disappeared. With this book, co-authors Brenda Lee Pryce, Betsy Teter, and Jim Neighbors have introduced readers to the pioneering black men and women who lived and worked in these early neighborhoods: clergymen, educators, newsmen, artisans, attorneys, physicians, activists, musicians, caregivers, and more. In the face of frequent oppression, these men and women laid a strong foundation for those who followed them.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, as well as from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.